Okay, take two. First time I tried this, it didn't seem to record, so I'm getting started on figuring out how all this equipment works. I'm Michael. For those of you that know me, know that I've been teasing starting this podcast with another buddy from church, so I just wanted to sit down and test out the equipment, make sure this thing is still actually running, which it is. Okay. And so the name of the podcast that I plan on starting is Veritas at Fides. I took 5 years of Latin, and that means truth and faith in Latin. And the reason I wanted to call this podcast that Veritas et Fides is because I feel like in society we do a lot of very surface level conversations about what's going on, but we never really get to the deep rooted truth about where things are at. And I am a Christian man, and so I bring that perspective into the conversation of that Jesus Christ is Lord and Savior, and that His will not be stifled regardless of the negative things that are going on in this world. Just a little bit of background about where I'm coming from and the perspective I'm bringing to this podcast and these issues. I was born and raised in Spotsylvania, Virginia, in the heart of Civil War battlefields. As a biracial man, I did not have a lot of discrimination growing up. There's nothing growing up that I can actually point to. I had friends who were black. I had friends who were white. I've got a mother who is a teacher, who's white from the north, and a father who is black, who's a truck driver from the south. So I grew up in a lower middle class family. Did not come from wealth, and so there are definitely things in life that I struggled with growing up, and some things that I still deal with even today. So that's the perspective I'm coming from. As I was graduating college, I was diagnosed with Crohn's disease, which is an autoimmune digestive disorder, and I spent 3 years in and out of the hospital every 6 months in my 20s. And over that time, I racked up $18,000 in medical debt, despite the fact that I had health insurance. And again, this was in the middle of Obamacare becoming law. So I bring a perspective of that law did not actually decrease the cost of health care. I know that firsthand from dealing with it. So I was not one of those kids growing up that was in the popular crowd, was not in the in crowd. I was not a big time athlete. I was in marching band, had a small core group of friends who were great, and we all stuck together through some of us from middle all the way through high school. And so that's where I'm coming from as a kid and as a college student, having graduated, dealing with the medical issues, dealing with the financial issues. And so as we talk about some of these issues in society, whether it be race relations, whether it be public policy, that's the perspective I'm coming from. When it comes to dealing with those medical costs, that weighed on me for over a decade until a group of guys who I lived with in college a couple years back pulled their money together and helped me pay off that medical debt. And those are my Christian brothers. They're from across the political spectrum: Republicans, Democrats, Independents, Conservatives, Liberals. Okay. That's the kind of thing that shows that our society can be bigger than the conversations that's going on right now when we really care about our fellow man. And so that's the perspective I'm bringing to some of these issues as we move forward. And me and another buddy from church plan to get this podcast kicked off, and then obviously bringing people on as we're able to discuss specific issues that they have more of an expertise in. I have been a public school educator for over a decade. There was a year that I was involved in raising money for political organizations. Before that, I was involved in 2 startup companies around the recession, which also contributed to the issues of medical and financial situations revolving around the Crohn's, because both of those startups went out of business after 2 years. So I bring to a perspective someone who grew up different, who did not grow up wealthy, who had many struggles in supposedly the prime of your life in your 20s and 30s. And so that's where my political philosophy really comes from, is from that experience and then doing the research about actual public policy. So my political backgrounds, I've been involved in politics for over a decade now. I grew up kind of not really sure, not really paying attention. 2004, figured I was a Republican, so I voted for Bush's reelection. Would not have had I known now. Obviously, Kerry was not a good choice either. I wish we had better choices. But around that time, going into 2008, when I really started paying attention to both parties' primaries and actually watched the debates on both sides, a buddy at the time in college told me about this guy named Ron Paul, who in 2008 I thought he was crazy and didn't know what he was talking about. And so 2008 I ended up, and this will get me in trouble with my political friends, but I don't care. I'm telling the truth here. 2008 I ended up voting for Barack Obama because he seemed to be putting people first and wanting to bring about a positive change. I didn't understand good public policy at that time yet. And then, ironically, the reason I swung that way, because I was back and forth the whole time, I was actually rooting for Mike Huckabee in the Republican primary at that time, surprisingly enough. The reason I voted for Obama was actually Joe Biden. Joe Biden was the only one who had the common sense to say that Iraq has 3 different groups of people, and we are not going to force them to work together. Everybody else was trying to force the 3 different factions in Iraq to work together. And I was like, that guy actually has some common sense and understanding. So, ironically, he's the one that persuaded me to vote for Barack Obama in 2012. As things kept going, I was not in 2012, 2008, getting my timeline off there. Told you guys I'd be straight and truthful about stuff. I'll make mistakes and try to correct them when I do. If I don't, I'll go back and correct them later. That was 2008. Okay. As I did more research on Ron Paul after that election and saw that Obama's policies weren't actually driving the cost of healthcare down and were not improving society, especially after that was the time shortly after the recession where debt kept going up and things kept changing. I still could not get a consistent job because every time I got a job, those 2 companies went out of business. So that forced me to go back into the public sector, where I got into education, which I enjoy because it's something that I've always thought about and always said and recognized that a lot of young people, unfortunately, don't have the most stable of home lives. And so they need somebody to be a positive role model for them outside of the home. I wish home lives were more stable, and I'm sure that's an issue that we will get into, is how did we get to where the home is not as stable as it was decades ago. A lot of factors play into that. We'll go deep dive into that at some point, I'm sure. So as I did more research on Ron Paul leading up to the 2012 election, I started to understand that this guy actually made a lot of sense, especially when it came to dealing with the Federal Reserve and how its monetary policy impacted our society directly in a negative light most of the time. So 2012, obviously Ron Paul did not win the Republican Party nomination, even though I volunteered for the campaign and I lived in Northern Virginia at the time. And so in 2012, I ended up voting for the Libertarian candidate, Gary Johnson. 2016 rolls around, Donald Trump enters the scene. Okay, I was a Rand Paul guy, picking up the mantle from his father, Ron. I was not thinking that Donald Trump was a conservative on a lot of issues. At the time, he did end up doing a lot of conservative things. Certainly a lot of things that I still kind of questioned at that point in time. And so I could not bring myself to vote for him, so I ended up voting for Gary Johnson again in 2016. 2020 comes around. Pandemic shuts everything down. Crazy election. State this clearly into the camera. Donald Trump lost 2020. Did the Democratic states in some cases change the laws and change the way that we vote in a unilateral manner that questionably violated some of their constitutions? Yes. So the rules were changed at the last minute, sometimes in a questionable manner. I would argue in some cases illegally, but that doesn't change the fact that Joe Biden got more votes in 2020 than Donald Trump. Joe Biden won the election of 2020. Period. I actually voted for Donald Trump in 2020 because I saw that the left had gone too far to the left. There was not a Democratic Party anymore. There was a left-wing party, and I will use that language very intentionally because a lot of the old blue dog Democrats had been pushed out of their party, and that's where the issue was that I saw. So obviously, coming up to 2024, again, I do not like where we're at in society, how we have conversations about issues. We have very surface level issues. There's part of there's strains of the MAGA right that I don't agree with, and there's strains on the left that I strongly disagree with. So, but because of the economy under Donald Trump the first time starting to get better, and the people who he put into judicial places, I ended up voting for Donald Trump in 2024 again. So that's where I'm coming from. I laid out all my political votes there. It's probably going to make everybody mad at some point, because they're probably going to, the right will attack me for voting for Democrat at one point, the left will attack me for voting for Donald Trump. It is what it is. We need to be able to have a more civilized conversation about the issues rather than galvanizing around these personalities. And so as this podcast kicks off, my goal is to really delve into the issues and not the personalities of the people in charge. Don't expect it to be very popular because I just don't think we're ready for it in society, but hopefully just bringing a different perspective and a different voice will start something different in society. So for those of you that, stayed with me and haven't turned it off because you didn't like who I voted for, appreciate you. I hope to have a more robust conversation as we move forward. Thanks.